This week in GESM 160, we will examine issues in tests and measurement. We will start this lecture by taking a look at test bias and test fairness. Both test bias and test fairness are controversial topics. Test scores can vary across different racial, ethnic, gender, age, or other groups due to factors that are unrelated to the purpose of the test. This type of repeated occurrence is evidence of test bias. If a group consistently scores higher or lower than other groups, the test may be presenting observed scores that either over or underestimate the test taker's true score. Remember, a test taker's observed score plus error score is equal to the test taker's true score. While test bias results from a statistical difference between group scores, test fairness, on the other hand, questions the values and beliefs used to decide how to use the results of a test. In other words, test bias is a psychometric concept, but test fairness is a social issue. Since deciding what is fair or unfair is a personal judgment based on what a person values, test fairness is often the topic of debate. When we think about test fairness, we have to ask ourselves, is it socially acceptable to place people in different social categories, given or deny interventions, or even admit or deny admittance to a program based on test results? Let's examine this a bit closer on the next slide. Think back to our lecture on test validity. In order for a test to be valid, it must be unbiased and fair. One specific type of validity that speaks to test fairness is consequential validity. Consequential validity concerns how tests are used and how the results are interpreted. Those who are developing and using tests need to think critically about the purpose of a test, how a test is interpreted, and what the consequences of their interpretations will be. If a group consistently scores lower than other groups on a test, is it okay to use this test to make decisions? For example, if females scored lower on a given test than males, could this test be ethically used to exclude females from a school, program, or other benefit? We know that a certain amount of error exists in any test and that a person's true score is only theoretical and can never be accurately measured. These are important aspects of testing and measurement to keep in mind when deciding how to use tests and how to interpret their results. Standardized tests are a big business, with the four major corporations earning nearly $2 billion per year and spending millions of dollars to lobby state and federal officials to support policies that include mandated assessments, such as the standardized tests you likely took at the end of every school year while you were in elementary, middle, and high school. One organization that works to end the misuses and flaws of standardized testing and to ensure that evaluation of students, teachers, and schools is fair, open, valid, and educationally beneficial is the National Center for Fair and Open Testing. They have 5 basic principles. First, assessment should be fair and valid. The group, also known as Fair Test, believes that tests should not only assess what is intended, but should not be biased against individuals based on classifications such as race, gender, native language, etc. Second, assessment should be open. The public should have much more access to information, such as the reliability and validity of tests. Next, tests should be used appropriately. This principle speaks directly to test fairness. Fair Test espouses that standardized tests should not be the sole factor on which educational decisions are made. In addition, evaluation of students and schools should consist of multiple types of assessment conducted over time. This principle would eliminate any one test occurrence or one type of test from having such high stakes. In essence, this principle is saying we shouldn't put all of our eggs in one basket. Lastly, alternative assessments should be used. Resources should be used to develop alternative tests that are more fair and accurate, especially when they are used to make important decisions such as whether a child needs special education, whether a person is going to be admitted to college, or labeling a person with a certain level of intelligence. Next, we will take a closer look at test bias. Remember that test bias is evident when different groups consistently score higher or lower than other groups taking the same test. So is test bias a part of the error score, or do some tests really measure true differences in groups? First, if the test was measuring differences in groups unintentionally, this would be a problem with validity. Second, making this determination requires an in-depth empirical investigation. While this type of investigation is beyond the scope of this lecture, we will take a look at 4 models of test bias that allow us to examine test bias more closely. The first model is called difference-difference bias. This model declares that there is test bias if two groups differ on some factor obviously unrelated to the test. For example, if female and male scores differed on a test that is intended to assess reading comprehension skills, the difference-difference model would identify this difference as test bias. Instead of looking at an entire test, we can also evaluate individual items of a test for bias. The item-by-item model analyzes group differences on an item-by-item basis and then further examines the discrepancies found. Another model, referred to as on the face of things in the Salkind book, examines the face value of individual items. For example, many times when reading about a person, there is a tendency to only use the male pronouns he, him, or his. If this were the case on a test, it may be concluded that the test is gender biased. Finally, the Cleary model uses sophisticated statistical analyses called regressions to determine if a test reliably predicts what it is intended to for all groups. For example, SAT scores are supposed to predict first-year college GPA scores. The Cleary model assesses if the relationship between a person's SAT score and their freshman GPA is the same for various groups, such as different races or genders. Next, we will review a few major laws that affect testing and measurement in the United States. There are many legal aspects to testing and measurement in the United States. If you attended school in the U.S. anytime during 3rd through 8th grade, then you were affected by the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. For the past decade and a half, NCLB has been a controversial federal law that all public schools were required to follow. It mandated that all 3rd through 8th grade students were required to take standardized math and reading tests annually. These scores were used to determine if schools had met their annual yearly progress, the benchmark of which increased yearly until reaching the end goal of 100% during the 2013-2014 school year. In other words, it was expected that all 3rd through 8th grade students in the United States would score proficient or advanced on the annual reading and math standardized tests by May of 2014. Schools that did not meet their yearly benchmarks received penalties. This law was also controversial due to a provision that required all public high schools to provide military recruiters with access to schools as well as contact information for every student. Recently, on November 19, 2015, both the House and Senate voted to replace the No Child Left Behind law. While students in grades 3 through 8 will still be required to take annual reading and math standardized tests, scores will not be used to assign penalties to schools. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004 is the current law that addresses the equity of and access to education for children with special needs. IDEA has 6 principles that are laws which all public schools must adhere to. First, all children are entitled to a free, appropriate public education, meaning all children in the U.S. have the right to a free education regardless of their cognitive, physical, or emotional differences. Second, evaluations and assessments will take place only to the extent that they help place the child in the correct program and measures his or her progress. This principle also requires accommodations be made for students in order to avoid a biased testing situation. The third law is that each student with special needs will have an IEP, or Individualized Education Program. This principle is particularly important since learners with cognitive, physical, or emotional differences have diverse needs and would not have appropriate access to education with a one-size-fits-all program. Next, children with disabilities will be educated in the least restrictive environment, meaning students with special needs cannot be removed from a general education classroom unless there is a disadvantage to them participating with their non-disabled peers. The fifth law is that both students and parents play a prominent role in the decision-making process. For example, parents and the child have the right to participate in the IEP meeting where academic decisions are made about the child's education. Finally, There should be a variety of mechanisms to ensure that the above 5 principles are adhered to. If there is any disagreement between how a child should be supported, these issues need to be resolved prior to the child starting any special needs program. The last federal law we will review is referred to as FERPA, or the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. FERPA applies to public and private K-12 schools, colleges, universities, and any local education agency that receives funds from the federal government. This law gives parents and students the right to review the student's education record, but the records may not be taken home or copied unless there is a circumstance that does not allow the parent or student to physically visit the school. Upon reviewing the records, if parents or students find inaccurate information, they have the right to request that the information be corrected. Last, but definitely not least, schools may not release student information, including contact information, transcripts, disciplinary records, etc., unless they have written consent from a parent or student if the student is at least 18 years of age. In certain circumstances, such as if a student is transferring to another school, the records can be sent to the new school without written consent. In the recent past, there have been many ethical issues with the administration of tests and the methodologies of research studies. Hence, now many organizations have a board whose job it is to examine research studies in which humans participate to ensure that the study and its methodologies are held to high ethical standards. For example, USC has the Office for the Protection of Research Subjects, which oversees the University Park Internal Review Board and the Health Sciences Internal Review Board. Although internal review boards for different organizations develop their own code of ethics, there are many similarities between different boards. Here is a synthesis of the most common rules. First and foremost, no physical, emotional, or psychological harm should be done to any participants. Second, participant consent is required. Sometimes this requirement needs to be in writing with a signature. Sometimes a signature is only required if the participant would like to opt out of the study. Incentives must be reasonable as to not manipulate participants into their participation. Participants should remain anonymous. At no point should any participant be identifiable. Records should be kept confidential. This is required before, during, and after the study is completed. Results should be shared with participants. This can be done with a group of participants or with individuals as needed. Professional discretion should be used in deciding when to share sensitive information. For example, some information may only be given to parents if that information would cause psychological or emotional harm to the child who was tested. Appropriate assessment techniques should be used. So if any inventory was developed for participants over a certain age, it would not be appropriate for it to be used with younger participants. Tests must have appropriate qualities. Tests must be held to a high standard of quality. For example, tests must be valid, reliable, and eliminate bias. Lastly, methods and procedures must make sense. Testing must not exploit or be unfair to participants. Finally, as you are learning this week, reflect on these questions. What are your values and beliefs about testing? How should standardized tests like the SAT or GRE be used and interpreted? Why is it necessary to have laws regarding testing and measurement? What is the importance of an internal review board?